So, I made this. Hi folks, I'm Dupu, and this was my first ever electronics, 3D printing, making, building, project thing. Despite constant missteps, mistakes and malfunctions, I'm happy with how the project turned out. But first of all, what even is it? Well, back in the late 90s, Konami released an arcade game called Poppin' Music. For those not into rhythm games, imagine Dance Dance Revolution but for the hands, except there's 9 buttons instead of 4 and they're absolute units. I've been enthralled with the idea of playing Poppin' Music for well over a decade now, thanks in no small part due to videos like these. Look at them go! Jeez. So, rather than do the sensible thing of popping down to my local arcade to try out the game for myself, I figured I'd build a full-size arcade controller. Despite not having any experience with electronics, construction, or Poppin' Music. What could go wrong? Well, first we need to ask ourselves another question. Why? On top of our what? Most people don't build controllers, they buy them. Why build a controller instead of purchasing it? It turns out there's not many companies producing full-size Poppin' Music controllers. This one from DJ DAO costs a staggering $220 plus shipping. It's just a box with some buttons on it. Surely we can build our own for less than that. Right? So step 1 was buying a £400 3D printer. Okay, let's go back a bit. Before we can build a controller, we need to know how a controller works. Simply put, a controller is a device that sends out signals when you push buttons. How does it know when to emit a signal? In the case of a button, it's when a little component called a micro switch is activated. Here's how it looks. When attached to a button, pushing the button will activate the micro switch. This sends an electrical signal to a device called a microcontroller, which in turn translates this to a signal for the connected host device. So building a controller should be easy, right? You just need buttons and switches, a microcontroller, and a box to put it in. And a bunch of other stuff, but we'll get to all that. Let's break it down piece by piece. First, the buttons. They're 100mm wide, and the main reason I wanted to play Poppin' Music in the first place. Look at them. They're incredible. I didn't make these, I bought them from AliExpress. They're effectively cheaper clones of the high-end buttons you see in actual arcade cabinets. The nice thing about these buttons being clones is that you can effectively swap them out at a later time for other brands, because they all come in roughly the same shape, including these little nubs to help with mounting and alignment. Some buttons come with switches, some don't. Ours came with a brand of switch from a company called Ying Lucky. Next up, we need a microcontroller. I went with an ESP32 already mounted on a dev board. This can be flashed with either some software you found on the internet or some custom code you write yourself. I went with the latter option and leveraged the awesome libraries already available for ESP32 development to write something quick and dirty. This code checks for a voltage on 9 of the GPIO pins and sends a standard signal to the connected host device, meaning the controller can be used by any modern operating system as a regular old gamepad. There's also provision here to prevent bouncing of the buttons. Sometimes when you push a switch, there can be an in-between state where the switch is not quite pressed and not quite not pressed, and that can confuse the microcontroller. By adding a tiny bit of latency, we can confirm the state that the switch is in. So, we have our microcontroller and our buttons, but how do we put them together? We have a couple of options. My dev board came with one of these, a board that makes it easy to connect wires to the individual pins on the ESP32. You could glue this into a case, run some wires into the screw connectors, but I wanted to do something a little fancier. So I designed this, a simple PCB that I can hook the dev board into with a so-called JST connector for each of the buttons. This would make replacing buttons and switches super straightforward in the future. I was a little nervous doing this, but it turns out designing a PCB is super simple. I used a piece of software called KiCad to put together a basic schematic, and then used its PCB editor to design the board itself. I sent off this design to a PCB manufacturer called JLC PCB, who is not the sponsor of today's video. After all, this channel has less than 200 subscribers, you are very safe here. A little while later, I had my PCBs. After I soldered all the connectors on, my little microcontroller was ready. Here's a free tip. Don't do this while wearing white cotton gloves. In fact, this one came out so badly, I had to redo it off camera out of shame. So, this is all well and good, but now we've just got a bunch of loose buttons and our brain hanging out. It's simply not usable. Here is where I make my biggest and most expensive mistake. Desperate to avoid manual labor, I ask myself a question that will cause me untold grief down the line. Is 3D printing an option here? The short answer is yeah, of course. The long answer is yeah, of course, but how much pain are you willing to put yourself through? But I didn't think about that. I went ahead and bought myself a Bamboo P1S, because their marketing and ubiquity had successfully worked on my tiny little brain. I ended up designing the case as two separate components, the base and the lid. Because these components would be larger than my print bed, each would have to be printed in multiple parts and attached somehow. This somehow would turn out to be the major headache of this approach. The problem is that these parts have very, very thin walls, meaning glue alone wouldn't form the strongest bond. There's just not a lot of surface area for it to work with. The solution I went with was to use the Bamboo's built-in slicer to create dovetail joints between adjacent pieces, and then use glue on top of that. This isn't perfect. You can absolutely snap the pieces apart with enough force, but it works way better than just using the glue alone. In the end, I only glued together the base pieces. I figured the lid would hopefully just sit on top of the base. It wasn't until later that I realized I should have pre-sliced the components in Fusion and added some kind of more robust connection mechanism manually. But you live and learn. Before committing to the full print, I made a few test prints to make sure everything lined up. Looks good. Now we have all our components, let's stick them together. Rather than seat the PCB in a sensible position by the wall of the case, I instead opted to buy a USB-C extender, which I mount on the back of the case. And just like that, we have a controller. Let's test it out. Well, that was a lot of money to be bad at a game. How much money? Let's review. We're going to do this on a per controller basis. For a lot of the stuff I purchased, I had bits left over. For these components, I prorated the price to reflect a single controller's use of those components. The case is made of about 1.2 kilograms of PLA. At the price I got it, that ends up being about £13. The screws and inserts that hold everything in worked out to a little over £2. I ordered 5 PCBs and used just the one, working out to £4. Funny fact, most of this price was in the shipping, something to think about going forward. The ESP32 dev board that sits in them cost about £6, and the various connectors that went on the board ended up costing about another £1. I got 20 connector cables and used 7 of them. These worked out to about 80p. I needed to crimp a couple more myself because these cables ended up being too short for the more distant buttons. The buttons and switches themselves cost about £30. Perhaps the most embarrassing expenditure was the USB extender, which cost £11. There were lots of other solutions here, and I didn't go with any of them. This brings the total cost of the build to about £70. Not bad, but also not great. There's lots of places to both save and spend money, and we'll talk about those in a bit. For those wondering about the cost of the printer, the soldering iron, and the other tools, I'm personally loath to include those in the cost of the controller because those will be used for other projects, but if you have to include them, you can add another £500 or £600 or dollars and you'll be in the right ballpark. Then again, ignoring the tools, it looks like we handily beat the DJ DAO's price point of about £170 plus shipping. Or did we? Yeah, kinda, but not really. Those DJ DAOs look a lot more solid, and their default buttons are also twice the price of ours, and they also came with these sexy Omron switches. Those are the types that are actually used in arcade cabinets. If we used their buttons instead, we would end up spending about £100 in total, or $135. We're also missing something, but we'll talk about that later. Regardless, one last extremely important caveat: the cost of something is not just its monetary value. This took quite a while to make. I had to design and have the PCB made, I needed to design the case, research how the controllers worked, write the software, buy the components, wait for those to arrive, print the case, solder the components. I started this project at the beginning of January and my final assembly was in the middle of February. There was a lot of downtime, but it's still a non-trivial process. So, what went right and what went wrong? Let's address the elephant in the room. Can I recommend 3D printing a case big enough to hold 9 100mm buttons and their microcontroller, especially with this design? No. My approach was ridiculous, especially given, yes, I'd never done any 3D printing before. There's some alternative designs for popping cases out there. This one by TD Linux is pretty cool. It's a modular design that screws together, much more stable. Link is in the description. But despite my plea to not print something like this, I'm super glad I did. I got to learn a huge amount about 3D printing, and I know my P1S is going to get a lot of use in the future. I'm looking forward to learning more about joining large 3D printed parts. If I was going to make another case, I'd probably investigate either a woodworking solution or maybe a sheet metal one. A lot of the work in those approaches, like cutting the pieces of wood down to size, can be done by external providers. The sky really is the limit when it comes to case design. Next, I got to learn how to design a PCB. That was neat, huh? The design itself wasn't perfect, and it cheated a little bit by effectively outsourcing all the small components to the dev board, but I felt like it was a good solution for my skill level. In the future, it would be cool to integrate the ESP32 directly onto my PCB and do away with the dependence on the dev board. This would end up being cheaper, but require some surface mount soldering for all those tiny little components. One thing I think was a little silly was using these 2-wire JST connectors when I could have ran a single daisy chain ground wire between all the buttons. But they hold the wires in real tight, so that's nice. As for the controller itself, it's fully functional. Almost. Yes, we have to address the 2 additional elephants in the room. First, a proper controller would have 2 more small push buttons, I guess maybe for like menu navigation or something. I decided to live without them, but time will tell if that's a big problem. Secondly, these buttons have LEDs inside of them. You can do different things here, like just hooking them up to power so they're always lit up, or maybe passing them through a transistor so they only light up when pressed. I wasn't bothered personally, but I know a few of you were screaming at the screen the whole time waiting for the glowies. So, sorry about that. That about wraps it up. This was my first foray into electronics and electronics YouTube, so let me know what you think. If you enjoyed the video, consider doing all of those YouTube things, and if you have any ideas for future projects, also pop them in the comments. It's a huge new frontier for me and I'm already having a blast. See you next time.